Have you not retaliated against American tariffs because you're concerned about the impact that would have in the upcoming CUSMA negotiations? And we've heard from Doug Ford, he thinks those negotiations are going to start in November, that Trump wants to move them up. When do you think that they're going to happen?
Thanks. First off, thanks for the question. We're in a situation right now where 85% of our trade with the United States is tariff-free. Our exports to the United States enter the United States tariff-free. 85% of U.S. trade into Canada is tariff-free. And we have put in place retaliatory tariffs in a way that looks to have the minimum impact here in Canada. That's why there's been various adjustments over time to remissions and others. We're in a position where we have the prospect, or we're engaged in discussions with the U.S., as you know, and have been for some time. The issues at the core of those negotiations will be similar to some of the issues that will come up naturally through CUSMA. There are issues around strategic sectors: steel, aluminum, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, lumber. And from our perspective, we're concentrating on those areas where our economies are deeply integrated, and working for win-win solutions between the two countries. To the last part of your question, in terms of the CUSMA review, as you know, it's scheduled for about 9 months from now. Normally, before any review process, there's consultations that begin well in advance, and so it would be natural that both in Canada, the United States, as well as Mexico, those consultations internally would begin in advance. And look, we're very conscious that there are...
When Mark Carney stepped up to the podium this week, the question he faced cut straight to the heart of Canada's trade strategy. Why not retaliate fully against the latest barrage of U.S. tariffs? The journalist framed it around the looming review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA or USMCA in Washington, hinting that perhaps Ottawa was holding its fire to protect those negotiations. Ontario Premier Doug Ford had already speculated that Donald Trump, rather than waiting until next year's scheduled process, wanted to push the talks forward into November. Carney's reply was calm, deliberate, and layered. He noted that 85% of Canada's exports to the United States already enter tariff-free, and the same percentage of U.S. goods flow north under the same terms. He acknowledged that retaliatory tariffs had been deployed, but selectively, and with adjustments designed to limit the damage to Canadian businesses. The focus, he stressed, was on areas of deep economic integration: steel, aluminum, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and lumber. And when he spoke about win-win solutions, it wasn't empty rhetoric. It was the framework for a strategy that sees the next 9 months, leading into the scheduled review, as a window for positioning Canada from a point of strength. If you listened closely, there was an unspoken subtext. The U.S. needs Canada as much, if not more, than Canada needs the U.S. Carney didn't shout it. He didn't dress it up in bravado, but he threaded it through the statistics and the matter-of-fact delivery. Remove Canadian steel and aluminum from American supply chains, and watch U.S. manufacturing seize up. Cut off lumber and pharmaceuticals, and industries from construction to healthcare feel the shock. Even when U.S. tariffs strike Canadian goods, American manufacturers often bear the brunt, because they rely on Canadian parts to keep their own lines moving. The stakes are bigger than the average tariff skirmish. CUSMA, which replaced NAFTA in 2020, is designed to undergo a full review every 6 years, with the next one officially due in 2026. But before that review happens, a formal consultation process kicks off, often a year or more in advance. Ford's comments suggest Trump wants to accelerate that timetable. For him, speed is leverage. The faster talks begin, the less time Ottawa and Mexico City have to prepare detailed strategies, and the more Trump can shape the agenda to his advantage. Ford's warning was blunt. Fasten your seatbelt, he's coming at us hard. In his view, Trump could, at any moment, blow up the agreement with a single signature, rules or not. That's not hyperbole, it's a reflection of Trump's history. In 2018, he invoked national security to justify tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. The move was widely read as political pressure, part of a broader pattern of using trade measures as bargaining chips. Dairy disputes, auto manufacturing threats, softwood lumber fights, they're all part of the same playbook. Just days ago, the pattern repeated. Trump announced a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian goods in key sectors. This time, Carney's counterpunch looked different. Rather than mirroring the hit with across-the-board retaliatory tariffs, Ottawa is pulling back in areas where countermeasures would harm Canadian industries more than U.S. ones. Auto manufacturing is a prime example. Many Canadian-made components are essential to U.S. assembly lines. Tax those parts and you don't just hurt American automakers, you risk Canadian jobs tied to cross-border supply chains. Steel follows the same logic. When parts made in Canada are integral to American production, hitting them with counter-tariffs can backfire. It's not capitulation, it's precision targeting. By keeping some retaliatory powder dry, Canada can maximize pressure when it matters most, during CUSMA's review when the economic stakes are exponentially higher. In that setting, the leverage isn't just about tariffs. It's about the architecture of continental trade itself. If the agreement were to collapse, both countries would default to World Trade Organization rules, meaning higher tariffs, more paperwork, and a sharp rise in uncertainty for businesses on both sides of the border. Carney's message is calculated. Canada's aim is not to escalate for escalation's sake, but to remind Washington, subtly but unmistakably, that Ottawa has its own levers to pull. Canadian energy exports, from oil and natural gas to hydroelectric power, feed directly into the U.S. economy. Critical minerals for electric vehicle batteries, aerospace components, and agricultural products are all woven into American supply chains. Interrupt any of these and the ripple effects are immediate. By linking today's tariff dispute with the upcoming CUSMA review, Carney is signaling a long game. The implication is clear. If Washington insists on flexing now, Ottawa can match that pressure when the review clock starts ticking. And while Carney's public tone is one of cooperation, the underlying message is unmistakable. Canada will not be caught unprepared. This is more than trade policy. It's a balancing act that blends economic strategy with political signaling. On one side is the need to stand firm against U.S. pressure. On the other, the imperative to project stability and reliability to other global partners. In recent months, Canada has deepened ties with the European Union and strengthened defense cooperation with allies in the Indo-Pacific. Those relationships become easier to forge when Canada demonstrates it can hold its ground in the face of a volatile U.S. administration. In that sense, Carney's composure this week wasn't just a performance for Canadian audiences. It was a broadcast to capitals across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Canada has options, and it knows its worth. The U.S. relationship will always be central, but it is no longer the only pillar of Canadian trade strategy. And as CUSMA's next chapter comes into view, that diversification could prove to be Ottawa's most valuable asset. The political backdrop to this unfolding trade drama is as volatile as the economic one. Donald Trump's return to the White House has reignited a style of governance defined by abrupt policy shifts, public spectacle, and an instinct for leverage through confrontation. In this environment, the CUSMA review is not merely a scheduled check-in. It is a potential flashpoint in the relationship between two of the world's largest trading partners. Trump's earlier record leaves little doubt about his willingness to weaponize tariffs as both punishment and bargaining chip. The 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs were a clear example, framed as a national security necessity but widely interpreted as pressure to extract concessions in NAFTA renegotiations. The result was a tense and often unpredictable set of talks that ultimately birthed CUSMA. Now, the cycle appears poised to repeat itself, with the same key sectors, steel, aluminum, autos, and agriculture, once again caught in the crosshairs. What's different this time is Canada's economic posture. While still deeply tied to U.S. markets, Ottawa has spent the last several years diversifying its trade portfolio. Agreements with the European Union, CATA, the United Kingdom, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, have created new avenues for Canadian goods and services. These deals do not eliminate the importance of U.S. access, but they give Canada greater resilience in the face of American volatility. Mark Carney's strategy reflects that shift. By resisting the temptation to blanket the U.S. with counter-tariffs, Ottawa preserves flexibility and avoids self-inflicted wounds. Retaliation is targeted where it can generate genuine pressure without undermining Canadian industries. This precision approach has a secondary benefit. It underscores to international partners that Canada is a rational, rules-based actor, even when provoked. In an era when protectionism is resurging globally, that reputation has currency. The stakes in a potential accelerated CUSMA review are enormous. The agreement governs nearly $2 trillion in annual trade. For sectors like the automotive industry, the rules on content, labor standards, and tariffs directly shape the viability of cross-border manufacturing. A renegotiation under Trump's direction could seek to rewrite these terms in ways that tilt more heavily toward U.S. producers or dismantle them altogether. Doug Ford's blunt warning that Trump could pull the carpet out from underneath us reflects the structural fragility built into CUSMA. Unlike NAFTA, which lacked an explicit termination mechanism, CUSMA contains a sunset clause that requires all three parties to reaffirm their commitment every 6 years. Failure to do so triggers a countdown to termination. That clause, meant to keep the agreement fresh, is also a political lever for anyone willing to threaten its survival. For Canada, the challenge is to prepare for both scenarios: a renegotiation where the U.S. demands significant concessions, and the possibility that Trump might use the threat of withdrawal as a political spectacle in itself. In either case, Ottawa's best defense lies in demonstrating that Canada's trade relationship is indispensable, not only to Canadian prosperity, but to the functioning of the U.S. economy. This is why Carney's remarks about win-win outcomes carry weight beyond polite diplomacy. They are a reminder that the integrated nature of North American supply chains is not a weakness to be exploited, but a shared asset. When Canadian parts, materials, and expertise flow into U.S. manufacturing, both countries benefit. When they are disrupted, both suffer. In a climate where politics can override economics, keeping that reality at the forefront of negotiations is essential. It is also a message aimed at a domestic audience. Carney's measured tone and emphasis on strategic sectors are a reassurance to Canadian businesses that Ottawa is not reacting impulsively. For industries already absorbing the shock of a 35% tariff on key exports, the idea that countermeasures will be surgical rather than sweeping is meant to inspire confidence. The government is signaling that it understands the difference between symbolic retaliation and actions that protect the long-term viability of Canadian jobs. Still, there is a political risk in this restraint. Trump thrives on framing disputes in zero-sum terms. A limited Canadian response could be cast by U.S. officials as weakness, potentially emboldening further tariff measures. This is where the link to the CUSMA review becomes critical. By holding certain retaliatory tools in reserve, Ottawa ensures that it has bargaining chips for the negotiations ahead. In the high-stakes environment of trade talks, timing is everything. And spending your leverage too early can be as costly as not having it at all. Internationally, the way Canada navigates this moment will be closely watched. Allies and potential partners are assessing whether Ottawa can manage a turbulent U.S. relationship without sacrificing stability. For countries in the Indo-Pacific, the EU, and the Commonwealth, Canada's ability to hold its ground against Washington could influence their own willingness to deepen trade and security ties. If Canada emerges from the CUSMA review with its core interests intact, it strengthens its position as a middle power capable of balancing relationships with multiple major economies. There is also a deeper strategic layer at play. The U.S. is not Canada's only economic competitor. It is also a partner in global competition with China, the EU, and other rising players. North America's economic cohesion, despite political friction, is a significant advantage in that competition. Carney's careful framing suggests that he understands this dual reality. The U.S. may be a tough negotiator, but its prosperity is intertwined with Canada's in ways that neither side can afford to overlook. In this sense, the current tariff fight is a dress rehearsal for the larger contest ahead. Whether the review begins in November or next year, it will test the resilience of the North American trade framework and Canada's ability to navigate a White House where unpredictability is part of the brand. The challenge will be to defend Canada's economic interests without falling into the trap of reactive escalation. a challenge Carney appears intent on meeting with calculated patience. As the clock ticks toward the anticipated CUSMA review, whether it comes in November or next year, Canada finds itself navigating a political and economic tightrope. On one side is a U.S. administration led by Donald Trump, whose governing style prizes disruption over predictability. On the other is an interconnected web of Canadian industries and communities whose fortunes rise and fall with the state of cross-border trade. The choices Ottawa makes in the coming months will not only shape the outcome of this review, but will also define Canada's economic resilience for years to come. At the core of Mark Carney's strategy is a recognition that leverage is not a static asset. It must be preserved, sharpened, and deployed at precisely the right moment. The selective removal of counter-tariffs is more than a tactical adjustment. It's a signal to both domestic and international audiences that Canada is thinking several moves ahead. It sends the message that Ottawa will not act in ways that inflict needless harm on its own economy, and that it understands the value of keeping key pressure points in reserve for the negotiation table. The danger, of course, is that such restraint can be misinterpreted. In Washington's zero-sum political climate, any hint of accommodation risks being cast as capitulation. Trump's political brand thrives on narratives of dominance, portraying concessions from others as victories for America. This means that Canada must walk a fine line, firm enough to demonstrate resolve, flexible enough to protect its own economic base, and strategic enough to keep its most effective tools for the moments of maximum impact. This balancing act extends far beyond the CUSMA framework. The global trade environment is shifting in ways that demand adaptability. Protectionism is on the rise not just in the US, but across Europe and Asia. Supply chains are being restructured in response to geopolitical rivalries, technological competition, and the lessons of pandemic-era disruptions. In this context, Canada's efforts to diversify trade partners through agreements like CETA, CPTPP, and bilateral deals with the UK and Indo-Pacific nations are not simply hedges, they are lifelines. Carney's steady, measured messaging plays well on this broader stage. Allies and trading partners want to see stability, especially from middle powers like Canada that can serve as bridges between larger economic blocs. A Canada that handles U.S. turbulence without overreacting becomes a more attractive partner for those seeking reliable supply chains and predictable policy environments. In effect, every moment of composure in the U.S. dispute becomes part of Canada's sales pitch to the rest of the world. Yet the domestic political dimension cannot be ignored. For Canadian workers in steel mills, auto plants, or forestry towns, strategic patience offers little comfort when paychecks are squeezed by tariffs and uncertainty. Opposition parties will seize on any perception that the government is moving too slowly or failing to stand up to Washington. Carney's challenge is to communicate that patience is not passivity, that in trade diplomacy the most decisive moves are often the ones made after careful preparation rather than in the heat of the moment. If CUSMA were to collapse, the fallout would be immediate and severe. Canada and the U.S. would revert to World Trade Organization terms, meaning higher tariffs, longer border delays, and more bureaucratic friction. Industries built on just-in-time delivery systems, like automotive manufacturing, would face disruptions measured in days, not weeks. Exporters in agriculture, energy, and manufacturing would see costs rise and competitiveness fall. The political blowback in both countries could be fierce, with job losses and supply shortages hitting voters well before the next election cycle. It's precisely this mutual vulnerability that gives Canada leverage, if it is willing to use it judiciously. The integrated nature of North American supply chains means that economic pain inflicted on one side of the border often rebounds on the other. By keeping trade flowing in areas that benefit both economies, Canada reinforces the argument that cooperation is in everyone's best interest. And by showing that it can target retaliatory measures with precision, it preserves credibility when it warns that harsher responses are possible. The months ahead will likely bring a flurry of behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Consultations with industry leaders, quiet exchanges with U.S. counterparts, and coordination with Mexico will all feed into Ottawa's strategy. The goal will be to enter the review whenever it begins, with a unified domestic front, a clear set of priorities, and a readiness to push back against terms that undermine Canadian interests. Trump's unpredictability makes this a high-risk game. He could choose to escalate suddenly, perhaps even before formal review talks begin, forcing Canada to respond more aggressively. Or he could use the threat of withdrawal as a bargaining chip to extract concessions. Either way, Carney's measured approach suggests a belief that Canada's best defense is a blend of preparedness, economic diversification, and a willingness to act decisively when the timing is right. In the end, this moment is about more than tariffs, or even the fate of CUSMA. It's a test of whether Canada can navigate an era of volatile superpower politics without losing sight of its own long-term goals. It's about proving, to Washington, to the world, and to Canadians themselves, that the country's economic future will not be dictated solely by the shifting moods of its largest neighbor. Carney's comments in Trenton were delivered with the calm of someone who understands both the stakes and the strategy required to meet them. Behind the careful phrasing was a clear message. Canada knows its worth, it knows its options, and it is prepared to defend them. In a world where trade disputes can spiral into political crises overnight, that kind of quiet confidence may be the most powerful weapon of all.